auctioned on a wooden block to the highest bidder. A cowboy outbid them all and made her his queen. I wasn't supposed to be in Caldwell that day. Had planned to ride straight through to Pratt, pick up a new ram from a man named Decker, and be back before the first frost hit the north pasture. That was the plan. But the gray's left foreleg had been favoring since mid-morning, nothing you could see, just the way she leaned into her stride on rocky ground, and by the time I crossed into Caldwell I knew she needed rest and water and soft earth under her feet, and that was that. So I tied her at the trough outside Myers Hardware and walked down the main street looking for something to eat, and that's when I heard it. Not shouting, not the kind of noise a fight makes, or a drunk, or somebody's horse spooked loose in traffic. This was different. This was a crowd noise. That low, gathered, breathing kind of noise a crowd makes when it wants something and thinks it's about to get it. I turned the corner near the stockyards and saw them. 40, maybe 50 men. Some I recognized, cattlemen, merchants, a few drifters, standing in a rough half-circle around a flatbed wagon that had been backed up against the loading dock of a place that used to be a grain warehouse before Hendricks sold it off, and it changed hands twice, and nobody seemed to know what it was anymore. The wagon had a wooden platform built on it. Crude thing, raw planks nailed fast with no regard for anything but function. And on that platform there was an auctioneer I'd never seen before, a fat man in a brown coat with a voice like gravel in a tin bucket, and he was talking. I couldn't make out the words yet. I moved closer. Standing to the side of the auctioneer, there were 3 women. My stomach dropped. I'd heard of this. Men talked about it, the kind of talk you hear around fires when the whiskey's been passed too many times, talk that gets quiet when a decent man walks up. Settlements out in the territories where men outnumbered women 8 or 10 to 1, and money and loneliness and the wrong kind of men in the right kind of positions meant that women without kin, without resources, without anyone to stand for them, could end up on a platform. I had always filed it away as something that happened somewhere else, to other people. There it was. The 3 women were standing very still. That's the thing I remember most from that first look. How still they stood, not the stillness of peace. The stillness of women who have learned that movement draws attention and attention draws trouble, so you stand still and you look at a fixed point somewhere above and ahead of you, and you keep your face as flat as you can manage and you wait for it to be over. 2 of them were older. One looked frightened. One looked like she'd gone somewhere inside herself and locked the door. The 3rd one was younger. She was looking straight at the crowd, not at a fixed point above them, at their faces one by one. Her jaw was set the way you set a jaw when your hands are shaking and you're not going to let it show. Dark hair, some of it loose from a braid that had held better days. A dress that had been good once and wasn't anymore. She was maybe 25, maybe a few years either side. She was the one the auctioneer was talking about. I heard him then. Moving closer into the crowd, I heard the words, and I will not repeat most of them because they don't deserve repeating, but the shape of it was that she was unclaimed, that she was able-bodied, that a man who could keep her fed and housed was doing her a kindness by taking her on, and that bidding would start at $12. Somebody bid 14 before the auctioneer finished the sentence. I stood there for a moment. My hand was in my coat pocket, and I found the edge of my billfold without thinking about it, the way your hand finds a thing it knows. I had come out of the Cimarron country with a decent fall. Grass had been good. The market was up. I'd sold 32 head in Wichita at a price I hadn't seen in 4 years. I had money on me that I didn't usually have. Enough to buy a good horse or repair a barn roof or see me through a hard winter without worry. The bid was at 22. The woman on the platform was still looking at the crowd. But she'd found a man near the front who had said something I hadn't caught, and her jaw had tightened another fraction, and her eyes had gone colder than I'd seen eyes go in a long time. And I understood without being told that whatever he'd said had been the kind of thing that told her exactly what would happen if that man won. I said $30. Loud enough that heads turned. The auctioneer found me in the crowd and his face shifted into a professional warmth that made my skin crawl. A few of the men looked around too. I didn't look back. I was watching her. She'd found me, that dark-eyed look, taking inventory. Who was this? What was this? Was this better or worse? I kept my face easy. I didn't know how to telegraph what I needed to telegraph, which was, I'm not what you think I am, and I'm not what any of these men are. I just kept my face easy and waited. The man near the front bid 35. I bid 50. That quieted the front of the crowd. $50 was more than most of the men in that circle earned in 2 months. The man near the front turned and looked at me, and he was the kind of man you read in the first second, broad and red-faced and accustomed to getting, accustomed to money buying him whatever money could buy, and when he looked at me, I held his eyes until he looked away. 55, he said. 80, I said. I heard the number go through the crowd like a stone through water. Even the auctioneer paused. The man near the front said nothing. The auctioneer said, "Do I hear 85? Do I hear 85?" going once. Nothing. Going twice. Nothing. Sold, he said, to the gentleman in the back. I worked my way forward and paid what I owed, and the auctioneer handed me a piece of paper with her name on it, Clara Voss, written in a clerk's hand, and some business about a bill of sale. Language that I will not think about longer than I have to because it is the ugliest language I have ever held in my hand, language that should not exist. I took the paper and I folded it once, and I put it in my coat pocket, and I walked to the side of the wagon where they were bringing the women down, and I waited. When she came down the 3 steps, a man's hand under her elbow that she did not want there, you could see that in every line of her. She landed on the ground and straightened up and turned and found me, and looked at me with the flattest eyes I have ever had pointed in my direction in my life. I said, "I'm Caleb Rourke. I run cattle out near the Cimarron. I need you to know something before we go any further. I bought that paper so nobody else could. That's all it is. You're not property. You don't owe me anything. We can walk to the depot right now, and I will buy you a train ticket to wherever you came from, or wherever you want to go, and that'll be the end of it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I came from Abilene, and there's nothing to go back to." I said, "Is there anywhere else?" She thought about it or didn't, it was hard to tell. Then she said, her voice very level, the other 2 women, "Are they going to the same places I was going?" I looked over at them. The frightened one was being walked away by a man who was already talking too loudly and standing too close. The one who'd gone inside herself was standing alone near the wagon wheel, nobody claiming her, watching the crowd thin out. I said, "I don't know what I can do about the first one." She said, "The second one. Can you do something about the second one?" It wasn't quite a question. Her name was Margaret Fenn, the second woman. 40-something, strong-built from somewhere in Missouri originally. I bought her paper too. The auctioneer found it mildly amusing, one man buying 2 papers. He made some remark I chose not to hear, and paid for it out of the same money. And now I had 2 women standing next to me on a Caldwell Street in the late afternoon, and my gray mare was still resting her leg at the trough. Margaret Fenn took stock of me the way a person takes stock of a roof they're going to trust their life to. Then she said she could cook. Said it plainly, not like an offering, like a statement of fact, the way a carpenter tells you he can build. I said that was useful. Clara Voss still hadn't said much. She was watching the street, watching the men from the crowd disperse, tracking where they went. Watching the man from the front of the crowd, who had mounted up now and was riding out slow, the way men ride when they want to be seen leaving. When he turned the corner and was gone, something in her shoulders came down about half an inch. Just half an inch, but I noticed. I said, "My horse needs a night's rest. You 2 need a meal and somewhere to sleep. Tomorrow I can take you as far as my place, and from there we can figure out what makes sense for each of you." Clara Voss turned and looked at me again with those flat, measuring eyes. She said, "Why?" I said, "Why what?" She said, "Why do any of this? You don't know us. You spent a significant amount of money on a problem that wasn't yours." I said, "It bothered me. The thing I was watching bothered me, so I did something about it. That's all there is to it." She held my eyes a moment longer. Then she nodded once. Didn't say anything else. Just turned and looked down the street in the direction of wherever there might be food and waited for me to lead the way, and that was the beginning of it. I want to tell you what my place looked like at that time, so you understand what they were coming back to with me. I'd built the house in 1871, 12 years before. It was sound, I knew how to build sound, I'd done enough of it, but it was the house of a man who lived alone and had stopped noticing what that meant. 1 main room with a table and 2 chairs, a stove that worked, a cot in a side room barely big enough to turn around in. Shelves with goods on them, flour and salt and dried meat, organized by a system nobody else would ever understand. A barn that was in better repair than the house because the animals needed good shelter, and I'd put them first. There was a second structure out back, had been a smokehouse once, before I'd expanded it into something closer to a storage cabin. Weathered but tight. I'd run a stovepipe through it 3 years ago for reasons I couldn't now remember. That was what I had. I told them this on the ride out, gave them an honest accounting because it seemed owed. Margaret Fenn listened with her eyes on the horizon and said the smokehouse would do fine. She'd stayed in worse. Clara Voss was riding the gray. I'd put her on the gray since the leg had rested and the terrain was easier now, and she was quiet most of the ride, but every so often I would catch her looking at the land. Not the way a person looks at land they're trying to judge. The way a person looks at land that surprises them. The Cimarron country is like that. It can look like nothing, and then the light changes and it looks like everything. Once she said, "It's very open." I said, "Gets easier." She said, "I didn't say it was hard." That was the only exchange of any significance on that first ride. We got in after dark. I showed them the smokehouse and I started a fire in it. Kindling caught fast, wood was dry, I'd had the foresight to keep it stocked, and I left them blankets and a lamp and went and dealt with the animals. Unsaddled the gray, bedded the horses, broke the ice on the water trough. Cold night. First real cold of the fall, the kind that smells like iron and coming snow. I went inside and sat at my table, and looked at the 2 chairs across from the one I was sitting in and thought about what I'd done. $80 paid outright, plus the second paper. Plus I'd fed them supper in Caldwell before we rode out, and fed the horses, and bought a few things at Myers that the smokehouse would need. Blankets and a second lamp, and some extra food provisions, because what I had wouldn't stretch to 3 people without running short by the end of the week. I had done a strange and expensive thing on instinct, and I was not the kind of man who did things on instinct, particularly not expensive things. I was the kind of man who planned, who calculated, who laid things out in his head before he committed. I had been running cattle alone for 12 years, and every decision I'd made in that time had been deliberate. This had not been deliberate. I tried to locate the feeling that had made me say $30 to that auctioneer, and what I found was not something complicated. It was simply this: a woman standing on a wooden platform with her jaw set and her eyes level and her hands very still, looking at the men who wanted to own her with a kind of dignity that they had no right to be in the presence of, and something in me had said no. Not out loud, just no, this is not happening, not while I'm standing here. I'd had that feeling once before in my life. I was 19 years old and I watched a man at a cattle drive beat a horse that had done nothing but fail to be perfect. And something in me said no in exactly that way, and I stepped in, and I took the beating that was meant for the horse, and I didn't regret it then, and I don't regret it now. This was the same thing, only larger. I blew out my lamp and lay down on my cot, and listened to the wind come up and thought that by spring, most likely, both women would be gone to wherever life carried them, and I would still be here with my 2 chairs across the table and my iron smell of coming snow, and that was all right. I had done what I'd done, and it was done. That is not what happened. Margaret Fenn was up before me. I came out of the house in the gray pre-dawn to feed the animals, and the smokehouse lamp was already lit, and there was a smell coming from somewhere that took me a moment to identify, because it had been so long since someone else had made it in a place I lived in. Coffee, real coffee, not the thin excuse for it I'd been making myself. I stood there in the cold with my coat half-buttoned, and just breathed it for a moment. Margaret had found the kitchen stores and taken stock and started breakfast. By the time I came back from the barn, there were eggs on the table and bread that she'd made from my flour, honest-to-God fresh bread, and Clara Voss was sitting across from where I usually sat with her hands around a tin cup of coffee, watching me come in. I sat down. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Margaret sat down with her own cup and said, "The smokehouse is good. Needs one thing fixed on the window latch, but otherwise it's good." I said I'd fix the latch. She said, "The north pasture fence. I could see it from the upper slope this morning on my way to fetch water. 3 posts down." I said I knew about the posts. I'd been meaning to get to them. She nodded like a foreman taking note. She said, "Clara can help with the fence." Clara looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at Clara. Some exchange passed between them that had the texture of something already agreed upon before I'd walked in. A conversation they'd had in the smokehouse that morning, maybe the night before, maybe in some language that didn't need words. Clara said, I grew up on a farm outside Abilene until I was 16. I know fences. I said, I wasn't going to ask you to fix my fence. She said, I know you weren't, I'm offering. The fence took 2 days. Clara worked the way she said, she knew what she was doing, didn't need instruction, didn't pretend she couldn't do things she could do. She was quiet while she worked, mostly. Efficient. Every now and then she'd say something practical, we need more wire here, or this post's rotten all the way down, not worth saving, and I'd listen and we'd adjust. On the afternoon of the second day, while we were tamping the last post into the hard ground, she said without looking up from what she was doing, in Abilene, after my father died. There was a man who managed the farm while the estate was in dispute. He managed things in a way that wasn't legal, and by the time anyone untangled it, the farm was gone and I had $14 to my name. I kept tamping the post. I didn't say anything. She said, I've been working my way east trying to get back to a cousin in Missouri. Ran out of money in Caldwell. The man who ran the boarding house, he had another arrangement for women who couldn't pay. I didn't know that when I took the room. I said, you don't need to tell me this. She said, I know I don't need to. I'm choosing to. There was a difference. I understood that. She was making plain that she was there as herself, as a person with a history that was hers, not as a situation that had landed on my property. It was not a small thing. The distinction mattered to her, and so I let it matter. I said, I'm sorry about your father's farm. She looked at me then, a quick look sideways, then back to the post. She said, are you going to try to find me a train ticket to Missouri? I said, do you want me to? A pause, she drove the tamper down twice. Then she said, not immediately. November came in hard that year. The first real storm hit before I'd fully laid in the wood I needed, and I spent 3 days cutting and splitting while the temperature dropped and the sky went the color of old iron. And both women worked alongside me without being asked, Margaret, because she had already appointed herself manager of anything that kept the household running, and Clara because, as far as I could tell, idleness was genuinely intolerable to her. The storm lasted 4 days. We were inside a lot, the three of us, in the one main room with the stove going. I learned things in those 4 days. Margaret Fenn had been married for 18 years to a farmer in Missouri, who died of a chest fever 2 winters back. She had 2 sons, grown, who had their own places and their own lives, and who had not, this was said plainly, without bitterness, as a fact, made room for their mother in those lives. She had worked her way west hoping for something that she was no longer certain she could name. She was a practical woman with no sentimentality about herself and a great deal of acuity about everything else. Clara Voss had been educated more than she let on at first. Her father had taken her schooling seriously, an unusual man for the time, and she could read anything and she had opinions about everything she'd read. And she was careful about when she showed that because she'd learned that men who discovered a woman could think tended to behave in a range of ways, none of them entirely comfortable for the woman. She showed it with me gradually. A remark about a book I had on my shelf. I had a few good ones I'd always read when I could, and when I picked it up and discussed it back with her, instead of looking surprised, she'd been able to read it. Something behind her eyes shifted. Not much, just a small recalibration. This happened 2 or 3 times over those winter days. Each time, the same small recalibration. I told them a little about myself in exchange. About coming out of Tennessee at 17 with nothing but a horse and a trade skill, fencing, ironically, and working my way through Missouri and Kansas, and eventually finding this ground and putting my money into it year after year until it was mine, solid and documented and belonging to no one but me. About the years in between that I don't discuss in detail. About building the house in 71. About how the land had been hard and the land had been good and the land had been mine, and that was enough. Clara said one evening near the stove, "You've been alone a long time." I said, "Yes." She said, "Does that bother you?" I said, "It stopped bothering me some years ago. I don't know if that's the same as not minding." She turned that over. She said, "No, I think that's different." I said, "It probably is." And that was all that was said on that subject, but it sat in the room differently than most things that were said, and we both knew it did, and neither of us did anything with it yet. Spring planning, I consulted Clara without thinking about it. That's how it started. I was looking at my stock records one evening, and I said to no one in particular, Both women were in the room, Margaret mending something, Clara reading. I had 7 head I needed to move before the spring market, and I'd been trying to decide whether to drive them to Caldwell or wait for the buyer who came through in April. Clara said, "What's the price difference?" I said, "April buyer pays $2 more a head, but he's unreliable. Missed the route entirely last year." She said, "How many of those 7 can you hold over to fall without it costing you in feed?" I said 4, maybe 5. She said, "Move 3 now. Hold 5 for the fall market. If the April buyer doesn't come, you've already moved the 3 you needed liquid." I looked at her over the record book. She looked back steady. She said that's what I would do. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. Then I said, "That's what I'll do." Margaret looked up from her mending and looked at Clara, and something passed between them that I was not meant to fully read. Some small acknowledgement of something. I filed it away and didn't think about it until later. April buyer didn't come. Clara didn't say anything about that. Just looked at the road the morning he was due, in that direction, and then looked back at what she was doing. I came in from the south pasture that afternoon and she was at the table with a piece of paper, making notes. I looked over her shoulder. She moved the paper slightly so I could see, and she had been working out the fall market numbers, what we'd need, what we'd have, where the margin was thin. We, that's the word she'd used in the column header. Stock we, costs we. I stood there a moment. She said without looking up, "If that bothers you, tell me." I said, "It doesn't bother me." She looked up then, just for a second, then down again to the numbers. I pulled out the second chair, the chair that had been across the empty table from me for 12 years, and sat down and looked at the numbers with her. Summer. There are things about that summer I can still feel without trying. The weight of the air in July, that particular thick heat of the Kansas plains that sits on you like a physical thing. Clara in the kitchen garden, she'd started in May. She'd asked could she use the patch of ground behind the house that I'd never done anything with, and I said yes. And by July it was producing more than we could eat, which turned into the first time I'd had vegetables to trade in Caldwell in 4 years, which translated into cash I'd been spending on bought goods instead. She knew exactly what she was doing with that garden. Had thought about it ahead of time and executed it, and the result was sitting on the table 3 times a day in a way that made the house smell like something other than what it had always smelled like. In July, a man from down the valley, Pitcher, ran a small spread 2 miles south, rode up one afternoon. He was polite, but he had a look to him, and what he wanted to know was what the arrangement was here, meaning what was I doing with 2 women on my property, and was this a proper situation? I had him about halfway through that question before I was done listening. I said, "These women are here because I invited them. One cooks and manages my household. One helps with the stock and the land and makes more good decisions by breakfast than you make in a week. I'll thank you to ride back the way you came." He went red. He said something, some piece of insinuation about what a man alone with 2 women must be. I said, "Off my land, Pitcher." He went, muttering. He'd spread something in Caldwell afterward, some version of what he thought was happening, and for a while in town there were looks. I know there were looks. Neither woman said anything about it. I didn't say anything about it. I went to Caldwell with the garden surplus and traded it and came back and went about my work. The second time I had to deal with someone about it was at the stockyards in August. A man I'd done business with before, decent man, Haverson, I'd respected him, pulled me aside and said something along the lines of, "What's the situation out there, Rourke? Because people are talking and it doesn't sit right." I said, "Haverson, I'm going to tell you this once. There are 2 women on my property. They came to be there because they needed a place and I had one and I offered it. That's the whole of it. They work harder than 3 men I've hired in the last 10 years. They improve the place. Neither one of them is leaving because I told them to, and I haven't told them to because why in God's name would I if you've got a problem with the arrangement? The door's open." Haverson looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Can't argue with any of that." He shook my hand, and we went back to talking about cattle. There was a day in late summer. I had come back from moving cattle on the North Range, and I was tired in the bone-deep way of a man who has been working for 12 hours in heat. I put the horse up and came to the house, and I don't know why this particular thing hit me the way it did. There was a lamp already lit in the window. It must have been lit 100 times by then. Margaret or Clara, Whoever was up last before dark had taken to lighting the lamp in the window when I was out after sundown. So I'd have a light to ride toward. I'd noticed it. I hadn't said anything about it. But this particular evening I came over the rise and saw it. That small, warm square of yellow light in the window of a house that had been dark in its windows for 12 years. And I stopped the horse and sat there for a minute. I'm not going to tell you what I felt in that minute, because it doesn't translate well, and it wasn't a simple thing. It was the weight of 12 years of coming home to a dark window, and then the absence of that weight, and the absence of an absence is its own complicated sensation that I don't have a good word for. I said to the horse quietly, "All right." She twitched an ear back at me. I rode in. Clara found me the next morning at the fence line on the east side, where I'd been meaning to reinforce 2 posts. This in itself was not unusual by then. She came to find me about things, questions about the stock, something from town she'd been thinking about, occasionally just to work alongside me in the way we had found we could work alongside each other, which was without needing to fill the air. But she came to the fence line that morning with a different set to her. I didn't know what to call it at first. She stood next to me while I dug, and she didn't say anything for a while, and I didn't push her. Then she said, "I've been writing to my cousin in Missouri." I said, "Is she well?" She said, "She is. I've been writing to her off and on since March. I told her I was here. I told her the situation." I said, "What did she say?" Clara said, "She said I should be careful, that I didn't know you well enough yet." I said, "That's sensible advice." Clara said, "I've been following it, being careful, watching." I put the post-hole digger down and looked at her. She was looking at me. That direct look she had, the one that had been measuring me since that first moment on the street in Caldwell. Inventory look. Only this time it wasn't neutral. This time there was something in it that had decided something. She said, "I know you now." I said, "And?" She said, "And I think your cousin was right that I didn't know you then, and I think she'd agree that I do now." I said, "What is it you think you know?" She said, "That you stepped out of a crowd of men who wanted to own something, and you were the only one of them who didn't. That you spent 7 months treating me like a person with a mind and a history, and a right to make my own decisions. That you never once made me feel like a charity case or a problem or a thing that was managed. That last night when you came in from the North Range and sat down at the table, and Margaret put supper in front of you, you said thank you, same as you say every time, same as the first time, and the way you said it was the same way you'd say it to anyone whose work you respected." She stopped. The wind was doing something to the grass behind her, that slow wave it makes like breathing. She said, "Those aren't small things, Caleb. Men who do those things without thinking about it are not common." I didn't say anything for a moment. The post was there, and the digger was there, and my hands knew what to do with both of them, but I didn't do anything with either. I said, "I have not been trying to." She said, "I know you haven't, that's the point." I said, "Clara." She said, "I know this is strange. I know this is not a usual thing. I know I came here in an unusual way, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." I said, "No." She said, "But I have been asking myself for weeks what I want, not what is sensible, not what is safe, what I want. And I want to be here. I want to be here because I've built something here and because the land makes sense to me and because," she stopped, gathered. "Then, because you treat me like I'm worth something, and I had forgotten what that felt like, and now that I remember it, I don't want to give it up." The wind moved through. I took one step toward her and I put my hand on the side of her face, and she turned into it the way you turn toward warmth when you've been cold a long time, and I felt her breathe out, one long breath, the kind that has been held for some time. I said, "You're worth a great deal. I knew that in the first minute." She looked up at me. Her eyes were bright, not with tears. She was not a woman who cried easily. I had come to understand that, but with something that I didn't have a word for except maybe the opposite of fear. She put her hand over mine on her face and held it there. We stayed like that for a moment with the grass moving and the sky enormous above us in that way the Kansas sky is enormous, the way it makes you small and large at the same time. Then she said, "There's still the east fence to do." I laughed. First time I'd laughed that freely in, I couldn't tell you how long. It came out of me like something that had been stored up and needed air. She was smiling. That was a sight I had seen in pieces over the months, but never full, never directed right at me, and it was something. I want you to know it was something. We finished the fence. We were married in December, the second winter. Judge Harlan from Caldwell came out to the ranch. Clara had preferred that to standing in town, and I understood why, and I agreed. And Margaret Fenn was there, which was right, because it was Margaret who had said the first morning in that smokehouse, I am told later, that I seemed like a man who meant what he said, which had been the thing that got them both through the door. Margaret had found her own arrangement by then. There was a family 3 miles north, the Garfields, who had taken her on as a housekeeper and been astonished by what they had. And she rode over there 3 days a week and was paid fairly and came back the other 4, and that was the system, and it suited her. She had a room in the expanded smokehouse that was hers, properly furnished now, with a good rug on the floor that she'd made herself over the winter. She stood next to us in the front room when Harlan read the words, and she had a look on her face that she would probably have denied if you described it to her, but I saw it. Satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a practical woman who had assessed a situation correctly and made it work. After the judge left and we'd had the supper Margaret had made, better than anything I could describe, I sat at the table in my house that was now our house, and Clara was next to me with her shoulder against mine, which was a new thing that still surprised me each time, the warmth of another person against me in my own home, and she had her hand on the table and I had mine over it. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about the lamp in the window." She said, "What about it?" I said, 12 years of a dark window, and you lit it." She looked at me, then she looked at our hands. She said, "You were worth lighting it for." That was 11 years ago. 11 years ago this December. The Cimarron country has been good years and had years, same as it always was, and we've been through both and come out the other side of both. The east fence needed replacing twice more. The kitchen garden has gotten bigger every year because Clara has a theory about rotating the beds that has turned out to be correct. Margaret is still here, still 3 miles north and 3 days a week, still looking at every aspect of our household with the eye of a foreman who expects things done properly. We have 2 boys, 8 and 5. Clara is teaching them to read the way her father taught her. Everything, any book you can get your hands on, no exceptions. The 8-year-old has opinions about books already, strong ones, which I find I enjoy even when I disagree with him. I ride the North Range most mornings, and in the evening I come back over the rise and the window is lit. It is always lit. It has been lit every evening for 11 years, except once in January of the 3rd year when we had an ice storm so bad the lamp oil froze in the reservoir, and even then Clara had a candle going in it, just a candle, because she said the window needed light in it when I was out. I have thought about that day in Caldwell more times than I can count, about what it would have cost me to ride straight through to Pratt the way I planned, with my Gray's legs sound and my head down and my mind on Decker's ram. It would have cost me the 30 seconds it took me to hear that crowd noise and turn the corner. That's all. 30 seconds of not going toward a sound that bothered me. I'd have been back on my Cimarron ground by that night, supper out of a tin, 2 empty chairs across the table, the window dark. Instead, I said $30 to a man with a voice like gravel, and I said it again at 50 and again at 80, and then I paid and I walked forward and I said, "I'm Caleb Rourke, and you're not property, and you don't owe me anything." And she had looked at me with those flat, measuring eyes, and she had decided, over weeks and months, careful, the way she decided things, that I was worth her trust, that I was worth staying for, that the ground we'd built together was worth putting her name to. That is the thing I carry. Not the $80. Not even the ranch, though I love this ground the way I love few things. It's that a woman who had every reason to distrust every man alive looked at me for 11 years and found something worth staying for. Found something worth choosing morning after morning, year after year. She chose me, in full knowledge of what I was, not young, not easy, not soft. A man with a long run of solitude behind him and a tendency toward silence and an anger that lives in me quiet but deep when I see something wrong being done to someone who can't stop it. She saw all of that and she stays. She chose to stay. You'll have to trust me that it's the thing a man most needs to know about himself. Not that he's done big things or made good money or held his ground when holding ground was called for. That a good woman looked at him, the whole of him, the hard years and the silences and the nights he wasn't certain of much, and said, "You are worth the lamp in the window." That's what I have. That's what I carry. Some things you spend your whole life not knowing you need until you have them. I rode into Caldwell because my horse needed rest. I came home with the rest of my life. Some days that's just how it works.